Every spring, Emily's hayfield produced enough winter feed for her entire cattle herd. One morning, she watched in disbelief as 63 cows belonging to her wealthy neighbor poured through an open gate and destroyed weeks of carefully grown hay. Standing on the hill above the field, her neighbor smiled because he believed the financial loss would finally force her to sell. Emily didn't argue, threaten him, or make accusations she couldn't prove. Instead, she photographed every hoofprint, launched her drone, and began collecting evidence. What her neighbor didn't know was that those 63 cows were about to cost him far more than he could ever imagine. Every spring, Emily Carter looked forward to the same moment. Standing at the edge of her hayfield just after sunrise, she would watch the breeze roll across the thick green grass like gentle waves on a quiet lake. To most people driving past, it was simply another field. To Emily, it was winter. The hay growing there would feed her 60 Angus cows after the first snowfall arrived. Every bale represented weeks of careful work, thousands of dollars in feed she wouldn't have to purchase, and another season her small cattle operation could survive without taking on debt. At 42, Emily had been running the 80-acre farm alone ever since her husband Daniel passed away 6 years earlier. She wasn't trying to build the biggest ranch in the county. She simply wanted to keep the farm her family had spent decades building. Most mornings began before daylight. Checking fences, inspecting water tanks, walking through the pasture. Then spending the rest of the day repairing equipment or cutting hay whenever the weather cooperated. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. Just beyond her western fence stood a very different operation. Richard Lawson owned nearly 2,000 acres. His ranch stretched across the hills with massive barns, expensive tractors, and hundreds of cattle grazing behind miles of freshly painted fencing. Everyone in Ashton knew Richard. He was one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county. People also knew something else. For nearly 3 years, Richard had tried convincing Emily to sell. "I'll pay you a fair price," he had said more than once. Emily always gave him the same answer: "This farm isn't for sale." Richard would smile politely before climbing back into his pickup. But every time he drove away, Emily had the feeling the conversation wasn't really over. Then came a calm Tuesday morning in late May. Emily had just finished checking mineral feeders when she noticed movement at the far end of the hayfield. At first, she thought her own cattle had somehow slipped through a gate. Then she counted 1, 5, 12, 20. More kept coming. Within seconds, dozens of large black cows were pouring across the field, trampling fresh hay that was only weeks away from harvest. Emily's heart dropped. She climbed into her utility vehicle and raced toward the western fence, waving her arms and shouting. The cattle ignored her. By the time she reached the field, they had already spread across acres of carefully grown hay, crushing plants beneath hundreds of pounding hooves. As she looked toward the ridge separating the two properties, she noticed a white pickup parked near the fence line. From that distance, she couldn't make out the driver. The morning sun reflected off the windshield, hiding whoever was inside. For a brief moment, the truck remained still. Then it slowly turned around and disappeared over the hill before Emily could get any closer. She didn't think much about it. Right now, stopping the cattle mattered far more than identifying a vehicle on the ridge. Emily immediately pulled out her phone and began recording the damage. As she reached the boundary fence, something caught her attention. The gate wasn't hanging from broken hinges. The chain wasn't snapped. The latch hadn't failed. Someone had calmly lifted the latch, opened the gate, and left it standing wide open. Within 30 minutes, the hayfield was filled with people. Emily had called the county sheriff's office. Richard had called his ranch hands. Neighbors who lived along the county road slowed their pickups and gathered near the fence, watching the commotion from a distance. It took nearly 2 hours to move all 63 cows back onto Richard Lawson's property. By then, long strips of green hay had been flattened into the damp soil. Deep hoofprints covered the field in every direction. Emily stood quietly beside the fence, saying almost nothing. Richard walked over wearing his usual confident smile. "Looks like we both had a rough morning." Emily looked at him without replying. Richard shrugged. "Cows get out. It happens." They must have pushed the gate open. Emily glanced toward the latch. It didn't look pushed open. Richard laughed softly. "Well, livestock don't exactly ask permission. The sheriff arrived a few minutes later and slowly inspected the fence. He looked at the gate, checked the hinges, tested the chain, and found that everything still worked. There doesn't seem to be much damage to the gate itself, he finally said. Richard nodded. Exactly. Just an unfortunate accident. The sheriff turned toward Emily. I'm sorry about your hay. I'll include everything in the report. But unless someone actually saw the gate being opened, it's difficult to call this anything other than escaped livestock. Emily thanked him politely. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse Richard. She didn't even mention the smile she had seen on the ridge. Instead, she pulled out her phone. While everyone else focused on moving cattle, Emily began recording the damage. She slowly walked every section of the hayfield, every crushed strip of grass, every cluster of hoofprints, every damaged corner near the fence. When she finished, she launched the drone she normally used to monitor pasture conditions. From above, the destruction became much easier to understand. Dark trails cut across the field where dozens of cattle had wandered before spreading out to graze. She photographed everything. Then she walked back to the gate. The latch was still hanging exactly where she had found it. No broken chain, no bent metal, no splintered post. She carefully photographed the latch from every angle before placing a small evidence marker beside it so she could identify the exact location in later photographs. As the afternoon wore on, neighbors continued stopping by. Most meant well, but nearly all of them said the same thing. These things happen. At least nobody got hurt. You'll grow hay again next year. Emily thanked every one of them. Then she continued documenting the field. Late that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills, an elderly farmer named Walter Briggs pulled into her driveway. Walter had lived in Ashton longer than almost anyone. He climbed slowly out of his pickup and looked toward the damaged field. I heard about your hay. Emily nodded. So has everyone else. Walter remained silent for a long moment before speaking again. You know, I've seen Richard's cattle get loose before. Emily looked up. Walter's expression had changed. But somehow they always seem to end up exactly where Richard wants them. Walter Briggs stood quietly beside his pickup, staring across the damaged hayfield. I've seen Richard's cattle get loose before, he repeated. Emily folded her arms. How many times? Walter thought for a moment. More than I can remember. But here's the funny part. They never wandered onto empty pasture. Emily looked at him carefully. They always seemed to end up somewhere valuable. Fresh alfalfa, a newly planted field, someone's hay meadow. Walter shook his head. I never proved anything. I just thought it was mighty strange. After he drove away, Emily didn't head inside. Instead, she carried a folding chair onto the porch and opened her laptop. If Walter was right, there had to be a pattern. She searched through old editions of the Ashton County Gazette, county commission meeting minutes, and local farming forums. An hour passed. Then two. Just before midnight, she found the first story. 3 years earlier, another cattle producer had reported Richard's livestock entering a newly seeded pasture. The incident had been ruled accidental. The farmer repaired the fence and never pursued the matter. Emily kept reading. 6 months later, there was another complaint. This time, cattle had wandered into a neighbor's oat field. Again, there were no witnesses, no proof, and no lawsuit. Over the next hour, Emily filled an entire notebook. Dates, names, locations. Each case looked ordinary by itself. Together, they painted a very different picture. In nearly every incident, the damaged property belonged to someone who had refused one of Richard Lawson's business offers. Emily leaned back in her chair. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. But one thing was becoming clear. Richard always seemed to benefit from the accidents. The next morning, Emily visited the county clerk's office. She requested copies of publicly available property records. Several of the farms involved in those old incidents had eventually been sold, some within a year and others after several difficult seasons. Richard or one of his companies had purchased more than one of them. Emily didn't jump to conclusions. She simply added another page to her notebook. Back at home, she pinned a county map onto the wall inside her office. Using colored pins, she marked every reported livestock escape she could verify. By evening, the map showed something unsettling. The locations weren't random. They surrounded Richard's ranch like pieces of a slowly expanding puzzle. Emily stared at the map. If she ever wanted anyone to believe this wasn't just another escaped herd, she would need something far stronger than old newspaper articles. She needed proof. Real proof. As she lowered the map, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from a local beekeeper named Tom Harris. "Emily, I heard about your hayfield. I think I may have something you need." Tom Harris pulled into Emily's driveway just after breakfast the following morning. Unlike most farmers in Ashton, Tom didn't raise cattle. He kept bees. More than 300 hives were scattered across several properties surrounding the county. Healthy pollination meant healthy crops, and Tom spent much of the spring moving his bees wherever flowering fields needed them most. As he stepped out of his pickup, he carried a small metal case under one arm. "I wasn't sure at first," he admitted. "But after hearing what happened, I went back and checked." Emily looked at the case. "Checked what?" "My wildlife cameras." She frowned. "You have cameras?" Tom smiled. "Coyotes love stealing beehives. I started putting cameras near my apiaries years ago." Emily followed him into the kitchen. Tom opened his laptop and inserted a memory card. "I've got one camera about 200 yards from your west fence. It's mostly there to watch for bears. I forgot it could also see your fence line." Emily leaned closer as the video began playing. The screen showed the familiar fence separating her property from Richard's ranch. A timestamp appeared in the corner. 5:18 in the morning. The morning was still dark. Nothing moved. Then a pickup truck slowly entered the frame. It stopped beside the gate. Emily immediately recognized the ranch logo painted on the driver's door. A man climbed out carrying a flashlight. His face wasn't perfectly clear, but his jacket carried "Richard Lawson Ranch" embroidered across the back. The man walked directly to the gate. He didn't inspect it. He didn't repair it. He simply reached down, lifted the latch, pulled the gate open, then climbed back into the pickup and drove away. Less than 4 minutes later, the first black cow wandered through the opening. Soon another followed. Then another. Within minutes, all 63 cattle had entered Emily's hayfield. Neither of them spoke while the video finished. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "I figured you'd want a copy." Emily looked at him. "Tom, you may have just saved my farm." Tom shook his head. "Maybe, but don't celebrate yet." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" "The video proves somebody opened the gate. It doesn't prove Richard ordered it." Emily knew he was right. The person in the video could easily be described as a ranch employee making a mistake or someone forgetting to secure the latch. The evidence had become much stronger, but it still wasn't complete. Later that afternoon, Emily contacted an attorney specializing in agricultural property disputes. After watching the footage twice, he folded his hands across the desk. "This changes the case." Emily felt a wave of relief. Then the attorney continued. "But we're not finished." She looked at him. "What else do we need?" "We need to prove this wasn't negligence. We need to prove intent." Only then would Richard Lawson's confident smile finally begin to disappear. Emily's attorney didn't rush to file a lawsuit. Instead, he asked a simple question. "How much hay did you lose?" Emily hesitated. "I don't know." "Then that's where we start." Over the next week, the damaged field became one of the most carefully documented pieces of farmland in Ashton County. An independent agricultural consultant walked every acre with a measuring wheel. A hay production specialist compared the damaged sections with untouched areas nearby. Soil samples were collected. Drone images were matched with satellite records taken before and after the incident. Nothing was estimated without evidence. Every conclusion had to be supported by facts. The report grew thicker each day. Meanwhile, word spread across town that Emily had hired experts. Most people assumed she was overreacting. At the local diner, Richard Lawson laughed as he stirred his coffee. "She's spending more on experts than that hay's worth." Several ranchers chuckled. Richard leaned back in his chair. "If she wanted to make money, she should have accepted my offer to buy the place." Across town, Emily never responded. She spent her mornings repairing temporary fencing and her afternoons meeting with specialists. Every receipt was saved. Every hour of labor was recorded. Every additional bale of hay she now had to purchase for the coming winter was documented. Her attorney reminded her of one thing every time they met. Evidence wins cases, not anger. A few days later, the agricultural consultant returned with the preliminary findings. He spread several aerial photographs across Emily's kitchen table. The cattle didn't just eat your hay, he explained. They repeatedly trampled it. He pointed towards several dark paths crossing the field. Once hay is flattened at this stage of growth, much of it loses both quality and yield. Emily listened carefully. So I can't simply wait for it to grow back? The consultant slowly shook his head. Some of it will recover. A lot of it won't. He continued calculating. Lost hay production. Replacement winter feed. Reseeding damaged areas. Additional fertilizer. Labor. Equipment use. Temporary fencing. Every figure was supported by current market prices. When he finally reached the last page, he slid the report across the table. Emily looked down. Her eyes widened. The total estimated financial loss was several times higher than she had imagined. She had expected a difficult year. She hadn't realized the damage could affect the farm for more than one season. Her attorney quietly closed the folder. I think it's time Richard Lawson sees these numbers. 2 days later, the report arrived at Richard's attorney's office. For the first time since the cattle entered Emily's field, Richard stopped smiling. He was beginning to understand something he had never expected. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbors. It was becoming a case that could threaten both his reputation and his ranch. 3 days after receiving the agricultural damage report, Richard Lawson sat inside his attorney's office with the thick binder open in front of him. Page after page documented the destruction. Drone photographs, field measurements, hay yield calculations, replacement feed costs, soil recovery estimates. Nothing had been exaggerated. Every number was supported by professional reports. Richard flipped through the pages without saying a word. Finally, he looked up. She's making this into a much bigger deal than it is. His attorney remained calm. No, the experts are. Richard pushed the binder aside. They're just hired opinions. His attorney shook his head. They're licensed agricultural specialists. If this reaches court, their testimony will carry weight. Richard leaned back in his chair. So what's your recommendation? The attorney answered immediately. Settle. Richard frowned. You mean pay her? I mean resolve this before it becomes public. Richard laughed. I'm not writing a check because a few cows wandered through some grass. His attorney didn't smile. It wasn't just grass. It was her winter feed. Richard stood and walked toward the office window. For years, people in Ashton had backed down whenever legal paperwork appeared. Some couldn't afford attorneys. Others simply didn't want conflict. Richard had grown used to winning before a case ever reached a courtroom. He expected Emily to do the same. She'll get tired, he said confidently. They always do. Across town, Emily received a very different phone call. Her attorney placed a folder on the conference table. We contacted Richard's attorney. Emily looked hopeful. And they declined to negotiate. She nodded quietly. I figured they might. They believe you'll give up once legal costs start piling up. Emily looked out the office window for several seconds before answering. I've already lost my husband. I've spent 6 years keeping this farm alive. I'm not walking away because someone thinks I can't afford to fight. Her attorney smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. He opened another folder. Inside were the final court documents. Civil complaint. Evidence list. Expert witness schedule. Photographs. Drone imagery. The wildlife camera footage. Everything had been organized in precise chronological order. Nothing relied on emotion. Everything relied on facts. Emily picked up the pen. She didn't hesitate. With one signature, the lawsuit officially began. Late that afternoon, a county process server drove through the gates of Richard Lawson Ranch. One of Richard's ranch hands pointed toward the large equipment shed where Richard was supervising repairs. The process server stepped out of his truck. "Mr. Lawson?" Richard turned. "Yes?" "You've been served." For the first time in years, the smile disappeared from Richard Lawson's face. He finally realized Emily Carter wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking the court for justice. The Ashton County Courthouse wasn't large. It had served local farmers, ranchers, and small business owners for decades, and nearly everyone recognized someone in the hallway. On the morning of the hearing, every bench outside Courtroom 2 was occupied. Word had spread quickly. Emily Carter versus Richard Lawson. Many expected another small property dispute that would end before lunch. Few realized how much evidence had already been assembled. Emily arrived carrying only a single binder. Her attorney carried the rest. Richard entered a few minutes later wearing a tailored suit instead of his usual ranch clothes. He greeted several people with confident smiles before taking his seat. He still appeared convinced the case would collapse under its own weight. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. Emily's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, this case concerns far more than wandering livestock. It concerns intentional property damage supported by physical evidence, expert analysis, and documented financial loss." Richard's attorney immediately responded. "The defense maintains this was an unfortunate accident involving cattle. No one disputes that damage occurred. What we dispute is the allegation that Mr. Lawson intentionally caused it." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Emily's attorney called the first witness, the agricultural consultant. Using aerial photographs projected onto a courtroom screen, he explained how 63 cattle had crossed nearly every section of the hayfield. He compared drone images taken before the incident with photographs captured only hours afterward. The difference was unmistakable. Healthy, uniform hay had become a network of flattened trails and heavily trampled patches. Next came the hay production specialist. He explained how trampling at that stage of growth reduced both yield and forage quality. Then he described the calculations behind the financial losses. Replacement feed, reduced harvest, reseeding, additional fertilizer, labor, equipment costs. Each figure was supported by current agricultural market data. Richard's attorney questioned every number. The expert answered each challenge calmly, referring back to measurements, invoices, and accepted agricultural standards. The estimates remained unchanged. Emily's attorney then introduced the drone footage Emily had recorded immediately after the incident. The video showed the cattle spread across the field before they were gathered. It also demonstrated the scale of the damage while conditions were still fresh. Finally, the courtroom lights dimmed. Tom Harris's wildlife camera footage appeared on the screen. The timestamp, the ranch pickup, the employee stepping out, the latch being lifted, the gate opening, the pickup driving away. 4 minutes later, the first cow entered the field. The courtroom remained silent until the recording ended. Richard's attorney rose. "The video identifies an employee. It does not identify Mr. Lawson." Emily's attorney nodded. "We agree, which is why we'd like to call the employee who opened the gate." A side door opened. A ranch hand walked into the courtroom. Several people in the gallery turned to look at Richard. For the first time that morning, his confident expression began to fade. The man walking toward the witness stand had worked for him for nearly 12 years, and no one yet knew what he was about to say. The ranch hand slowly walked to the witness stand. He looked tired. His boots were freshly cleaned, but his weathered hands still carried the rough calluses of someone who worked with cattle every day. After taking the oath, he introduced himself. "My name is Jacob Miller. I've worked at Lawson Ranch for almost 12 years. Emily quietly recognized him. She had seen him repairing fences and moving cattle dozens of times over the years. Richard avoided eye contact. Emily's attorney approached the witness stand. "Mr. Miller, do you recognize the individual shown in the wildlife camera footage?" Jacob nodded. "Yes, that's me." Richard's attorney remained calm. "So you opened the gate?" "Yes." "Were you instructed to leave it open?" Jacob hesitated. The courtroom became completely silent. After several long seconds, he answered, "Yes." Richard immediately leaned toward his attorney. His attorney placed a hand on Richard's arm, signaling him to stay quiet. Emily's attorney continued. Who gave you that instruction? Jacob swallowed. Mr. Lawson. Richard suddenly stood. Objection. That's hearsay. The judge looked toward Emily's attorney. Foundation? Emily's attorney nodded. Your Honor, we're asking about direct instructions received by this witness from the defendant. The judge turned back. Objection overruled. You may continue. Emily's attorney faced Jacob once again. What exactly did Mr. Lawson tell you? Jacob took a slow breath. He told me to leave the west gate unlatched before sunrise. Did he explain why? He said, leave it the way it is. Jacob paused. Then, before he walked away, he said something else. What was that? Sometimes people make different decisions after a hard season. The courtroom remained silent. Emily's attorney continued. What did you understand him to mean? Jacob answered carefully. Mr. Lawson had been trying to buy Mrs. Carter's farm for years. I understood he expected the cattle to get into her hayfield, and I believed he thought the damage would put financial pressure on her. Richard's attorney immediately stood. Objection. The witness is offering his interpretation. The judge nodded, sustained. The last statement will be considered only as the witness's personal understanding, not as proof of Mr. Lawson's intent. Emily's attorney acknowledged the ruling. Mr. Miller, did Mr. Lawson ever directly tell you to destroy Mrs. Carter's hay? Jacob answered honestly, no. Did he tell you to release the cattle? No. But he instructed me to leave the gate unlatched, and that's exactly what I did. Richard's attorney began cross-examination. Were you promised anything in exchange for your testimony? No. Were you threatened? No. Why are you testifying today? Jacob looked briefly toward Richard before answering. Because I took an oath, and because what I did that morning has stayed with me ever since. Emily watched quietly from her seat. She felt no satisfaction. Only relief. The physical evidence established what had happened. Jacob's testimony explained how it had happened. Whether those facts proved Richard's intent would now be for the court, not the witness, to decide. After reviewing the day's testimony, the judge closed the case file. The court has heard substantial evidence from both parties. I will allow written post-hearing briefs before issuing a final decision. He looked toward both attorneys. Final submissions are due in 14 days. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. As people slowly filed out of the courtroom, Richard remained seated, staring silently at the witness stand. For nearly 12 years, Jacob Miller had been one of his most trusted ranch hands. Now, without accusing Richard directly of a crime, his testimony had connected the instruction to leave the gate open with everything the court had already seen in the photographs, the drone footage, and the wildlife camera. Everyone in Ashton was waiting to see how the judge would weigh those pieces together. By the next morning, everyone in Ashton seemed to know what had happened in the courtroom. No official ruling had been issued. No judgment had been entered. But people had heard enough to begin asking questions. The story spread from the grain elevator to the feed store, from church parking lots to coffee counters at the local diner. Not because of rumors, but because testimony given in open court was now part of the public record. Emily avoided discussing the case. She still had cattle to feed, water tanks to inspect, and equipment that needed repairing. The lawsuit hadn't changed the daily work required to keep a farm operating. When neighbors asked how she felt after Jacob Miller's testimony, she gave the same answer every time. I'll wait for the judge. Nothing more. Richard Lawson chose a different approach. He insisted to anyone willing to listen that Jacob had turned against him. He's bitter. He misunderstood what I said. He'll regret it. But the more Richard defended himself, the more people began comparing his explanations with what had been presented in court. Even longtime acquaintances became cautious. A week later, Richard met with his insurance representative. The company had reviewed the court filings and the expert reports submitted by both parties. The meeting was brief. If the court finds intentional conduct, the representative explained, your liability coverage may not apply. Richard frowned. What do you mean? Our policies generally cover accidents. They do not necessarily cover intentional acts. Richard stared across the desk. So you're saying I could be personally responsible? We're saying we'll have to evaluate the court's findings before making any coverage decision. It wasn't the answer Richard wanted. 2 days later, another meeting went even worse. Richard's operating loan came up for its annual review at the local agricultural bank. The loan officer had financed equipment purchases and seasonal operating expenses for Richard's ranch for years. Normally, the meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. This time, it stretched past an hour. The officer spoke carefully. The lawsuit itself isn't the issue. Richard relaxed slightly. The uncertainty is. Richard folded his arms. My ranch is profitable. No one's questioning that. But lawsuits involving potential intentional misconduct create additional financial risk. The officer slid a document across the desk. We'll need updated financial statements and cash flow projections. We'll also postpone approval of your expanded credit request until this matter is resolved. Richard's expression hardened. You're delaying financing because of allegations. We're delaying it because the court hasn't ruled yet. Richard left the bank more frustrated than angry. For the first time in years, people weren't automatically accepting his version of events. Across town, Emily received a phone call from her attorney. The judge has scheduled the final hearing. She set down the wrench she had been using to repair a hay rake. When? Next Thursday morning. Emily thanked him and ended the call. She stood quietly beside the machine for a moment before returning to work. The waiting was almost over. In just a few days, the court would decide whether the evidence she had spent months gathering was enough to hold Richard Lawson accountable once and for all. The courtroom was quieter than it had been during the first hearing. There were fewer spectators this time. Only the attorneys, a handful of local farmers, several reporters from the county newspaper, and the people directly involved in the case remained. Emily arrived early. She sat beside her attorney without speaking, reviewing nothing. Every photograph, report, and witness statement had already been submitted. There was nothing left to add. Richard entered several minutes later. His confidence had faded since the previous hearing. Instead of greeting people around the room, he walked directly to his seat and quietly organized a stack of papers. When the judge entered, everyone stood. After taking a seat, he opened a thick case file. I have reviewed the testimony, documentary evidence, expert reports, written submissions, and applicable state law. The courtroom became completely silent. This matter concerns more than livestock escaping a pasture. It concerns whether the damage resulted from an intentional act. The judge carefully summarized the evidence. First, the wildlife camera clearly showed the west gate being deliberately opened. Second, the gate itself showed no mechanical failure or storm damage. Third, independent agricultural experts established the extent of the crop loss using accepted professional methods. Fourth, Jacob Miller testified under oath that he had opened the gate after receiving instructions from Richard Lawson. The judge paused. The court finds Mr. Miller's testimony credible. Richard slowly lowered his head. The judge continued. The testimony was consistent with the physical evidence, the recorded video, and the sequence of events established during trial. Emily remained perfectly still. She showed no emotion. She simply listened. Finally, the judge reached his conclusion. Based upon the preponderance of the evidence, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Emily Carter. A quiet breath escaped from somewhere in the gallery. The judge continued reading. Richard Lawson was ordered to compensate Emily for the documented loss of hay production, the cost of purchasing replacement winter feed, reseeding and restoring the damaged field, additional fertilizer and soil recovery expenses, fence repairs and related labor, expert witness and agricultural assessment costs where permitted by law, and court costs as provided under applicable rules. Every amount matched the evidence presented during the case. Nothing more. Nothing less. The judge then looked directly toward Richard. The court emphasizes that private property rights depend upon mutual respect. No landowner may intentionally use livestock to damage another person's livelihood. This judgment reflects the evidence presented, not speculation, assumption, or reputation. With one strike of the gavel, the case was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited near the front steps. Richard left through a side entrance without making a statement. Emily walked out the front door. One reporter asked whether she felt victorious. Emily smiled politely before answering. I never wanted a fight. I only wanted the damage to be recognized. She thanked everyone and walked toward her pickup. As she drove back to the farm, she passed the same hayfield where the 63 cows had entered months earlier. Fresh green shoots were beginning to emerge across the repaired ground. The field wasn't fully recovered, but it was alive again. What Emily didn't know was that only a few months later, Richard Lawson would drive past that very same field one last time, and what he saw would stay with him far longer than the court's judgment ever could. The court's decision didn't repair Emily Carter's farm overnight. The damaged hayfield still needed months of work. Sections of the soil had to be reseeded. Fertilizer was applied according to recommendations from the County Agricultural Extension Office. Equipment rolled across the field again, not to harvest, but to rebuild. Emily approached the work the same way she had approached the lawsuit. One step at a time. One job at a time. The compensation awarded by the court covered the documented losses, but it didn't eliminate the effort required to restore the land. Every morning, Emily inspected the young grass. She checked moisture levels, monitored new growth, and kept careful records, knowing healthy hay depended as much on patience as on good weather. Word of the case gradually faded from conversation around Ashton. Farmers returned to worrying about rainfall, fertilizer prices, and cattle markets. Life moved on. One Saturday in early autumn, several neighbors arrived at Emily's farm with tractors, wagons, and hay equipment. Nobody had organized a formal event. One person simply offered to help. Another followed. Before long, nearly a dozen local farmers were working together across the field. Walter Briggs drove the rake. Tom Harris brought lunch for everyone working in the heat. Even a few younger ranchers, who had only watched the court proceedings from the gallery, spent the day stacking square bales onto wagons. Emily looked across the field with quiet gratitude. Months earlier, she had felt as though she was standing alone. Now she realized something important. People had been watching all along. Not to choose sides, but to see whether honesty and evidence still mattered. As the final wagon rolled toward the barn, Walter climbed down from his tractor and smiled. Looks like this field still knows how to grow hay. Emily laughed. It just needed another chance. A few weeks later, the County Agricultural Extension Office hosted its annual Fall Field Day. Farmers from across the region attended demonstrations on forage management, soil conservation, and pasture improvement. One display near the entrance attracted particular attention. It featured photographs showing how damaged hay fields could recover through proper reseeding, soil management, and careful planning. Emily's farm was included as one of several real-world restoration examples. The display focused on practical lessons, not the lawsuit itself. Captioned beneath one photograph summarized the message simply: good records, sound management, and timely action help farms recover from unexpected losses. After one of the presentations, a young beginning farmer approached Emily. I recognize your field. She smiled. I guess a lot of people have. The young man hesitated before asking, how did you stay calm through everything? Emily looked across the demonstration plots before answering. I couldn't control what happened, but I could control how carefully I documented it. She paused for a moment. The evidence did the arguing for me. The young farmer nodded thoughtfully. As the event came to an end, Walter loaded the last of the demonstration materials into his pickup. Before climbing into the driver's seat, he looked back toward Emily. You know, he said with a quiet smile, next spring we'll tell the real story. Emily followed his gaze toward the recovering hayfield. The grass was healthy again, but winter still lay ahead. Like every farmer, she knew no harvest was ever guaranteed until another season had passed. She smiled, locked the gate behind her, and headed home. The land had survived. Now it was time to see what it could become. The following spring arrived much like every other in Ashton County. The mornings were cool. The fields slowly turned green again. Farmers watched the weather forecast more closely than the news, hoping for enough rain to start another growing season. Emily Carter stood at the edge of her hayfield just after sunrise. Almost a year had passed since 63 cows had crossed through the open gate. Looking across the field now, it was difficult to see where the damage had once been. The reseeded areas blended naturally with the rest of the meadow. The long trails of hoofprints had disappeared beneath healthy grass. Nature had done what it always tried to do: recover. Emily smiled as she watched her first cutting of hay being loaded onto wagons. The harvest wasn't the largest she'd ever produced, but it was strong. More importantly, it was enough. Enough to supply winter feed for her herd. Enough to avoid purchasing expensive replacement hay. Enough to remind her why she had refused to sell the farm. Walter Briggs stopped his pickup beside the gate. He climbed out slowly, leaning against the fence with a satisfied smile. "I'd say the field won." Emily laughed. "I think the people taking care of it helped." Walter nodded. "Maybe. But fields have a way of rewarding patience." Together, they watched the wagons move toward the barn. Neither of them mentioned the lawsuit. There was no reason to. That chapter had already closed. Later that afternoon, Emily noticed another pickup traveling slowly along the county road. She recognized it immediately. Richard Lawson. He paused only for a moment. From his driver's seat, he looked across the neatly stacked hay bales covering the same field he had once expected would convince Emily to give up. Instead, the farm was thriving. The land had remained in her family. The judgment against him had become a lesson many local landowners quietly remembered. Richard never rolled down his window. He never waved. After a few seconds, he shifted the truck into gear and continued down the road. Emily watched until the pickup disappeared beyond the hill. Then she turned back toward the barn. There was still work to finish before sunset, as always. That evening, after the last wagon had been unloaded, Emily closed the barn doors and walked once more to the western fence. The gate stood exactly where it had a year earlier. The difference was that now every hinge had been reinforced. The latch had been replaced with a heavy-duty locking system. A motion-activated camera overlooked the entrance. Not because Emily expected trouble, but because good farmers prepare for what they cannot predict. She rested one hand on the fence post and looked across the quiet pasture. People sometimes believe the biggest farm always wins, or that money can solve every disagreement. But farming has always rewarded something different. Careful planning, consistent work, good records, the willingness to protect what you've spent years building. The 63 cows never destroyed Emily Carter's future. They revealed the value of preparation, the photographs she took, the drone images she saved, the expert assessments she commissioned, the witness who finally chose honesty. Each piece mattered, not because it guaranteed victory, but because it allowed the truth to stand on its own. Long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, Emily understood that the most important harvest from that difficult year had never been measured in hay bales. It was the confidence that quiet persistence, supported by facts, could withstand intimidation. On a family farm, that may be the most valuable crop anyone can ever grow. If Emily's story reminded you that truth needs evidence and courage needs patience, share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if a powerful neighbor had tried to pressure you into surrendering your family's land? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories about hardworking farmers, justice, and unexpected victories. Thank you for watching, and remember, quiet people are not powerless when they protect the truth with preparation, persistence, and facts.